For much of the 20th century, thousands of all-white towns forbade black people and minorities from being within the city limits after nightfall. These communities were known as Sundown Towns, both to residents and those passing through, and a lot of them happened to be in the South. They're scattered through all out the country, the Midwest, New England, California, Texas. These towns usually allowed black people and minorities to pass through during the day, especially if they were there to work, but they had to be out after dark. Otherwise, they risked being arrested, beaten, or even murdered by the residents who happened to be all white. Though their origins date back to colonial times, the era of sundown towns have been around since 1890. For decades, these communities either explicitly did not let minorities in, or they let them know that they were definitely not welcome. Sometimes they drove black residents out by force. Other times, they passed exclusionary laws to make sure that the African American population did not want anything to do with that town. Most of them intimidated black travelers who were driving through and threatened them with violence if they stuck around for too long. It's really difficult to know how many sundown towns there are in the United States, and I say there are because they are still very much a thing. But a sociologist once estimated that there was about 10,000 sundown towns across the country at its peak, which was only in 1970. After the Civil Rights Movement, some of these towns slowly began to convert and welcome black people, but other towns didn't. While few former sundown towns would describe themselves as a sundown town today, many of them remain largely white. And some black travelers and residents of these places maintain that sundown towns have never completely gone away. And they haven't. One of the first recorded examples of a sundown town in America emerged during the colonial era around 1759. His Majesty's province of New Hampshire passed a stipulation that forbade the nighttime travel of non-white residents under the pretext of preventing disorders at night. The law read, whereas great disorders, insolencies, and burglaries are ofttimes raised and committed in the night by Indian, Negro, and mulatto servants and slaves to the disquiet and hurt of Her Majesty's good subjects, no Indian, Negro, or mulatto servant or slave may presume to absent from the families where they respectively belong, or be found abroad in the night time after 9 o'clock. Unless it be upon errand for their respective masters or owners. These stipulations were also published in local newspapers where they were often enforced by violence by the white authorities. Few white citizens objected to this, obviously, and after all, many of them considered the enslaved people to be property. They didn't want their property to get away from them, did they? After the Civil War and the abolition of slavery in the United States, many white lawmakers in the South began to pass discriminatory policies that denied countless rights to African Americans. This time period itself would eventually become known as the Jim Crow era. Around the same time, sundown towns also began to take hold, and they started to move from the South. Of course, there's no doubt that sundown towns existed in the South and that white Southerners pushed black people out of their communities. During the brutal Red Summer of 1919, an armed white mob in Corbin, Kentucky, rounded up some 30 black men, women, and children and violently forced them into rail cars headed for other towns. However, many African Americans also began to leave the South on their own. During the Great Migration, over 6 million black people moved from the South to the North, Midwest, and West from 1960 to 1970. Many of the people who relocated were hoping for a better life elsewhere in the United States, but unfortunately they often found that racism was still a major problem, even in the sophisticated urban cities of the North. With the popularization of the automobile, black drivers were eager to explore more of the United States and find the best place to settle down or at least visit and be a welcomed guest. But while they're on the road, these travelers learned very quickly that they needed to avoid sundown towns at all costs. One of the biggest misconceptions about America's history is that the South, including any state that belonged to the Confederacy, was completely backward and racist, and the North, often called the Union during the Civil War, welcomed all races, colors, and creeds. A close look at the reality of sundown towns alone reveals that when it came to the treatment of black people and other minorities, the North was not that much different than the South. Certainly, the South was more overt in its racism, more outgoing, and it definitely made it well known to anybody who'd ask, and its sundown towns were no exception. For example, a sign that hung outside of Alex, Arkansas, once infamously warned, "Don't let the sun go down on you in Alex." And that was a hard R at the very beginning. 2 hours to the south, in Mina, Arkansas, a sign advertised the town as such: cool summers, mild winters, no blizzards, no Negroes. But while these literal warning signs were blasted through the South towns all over the country, it made it plenty clear that they didn't want black people or minorities there. The historic Route 66 is a sad example. By the 1930s, 44 out of the 89 counties that bordered the highway were sundown towns. Sundown town communities in the North, Midwest, and West may not have had offensive signs warning black men and women to stay out, but they were just as apt to enforce these rules and were not afraid to use brutal force if they needed to. In Duluth, Minnesota, 3 black circus performers were kidnapped from a local jail by a white mob, beaten on the street, and hanged from a telephone pole in 1920. A few days later, in Vienna, Illinois, a white mob took to the streets after a black man escaped from prison and set fire to nearly all of the African American homes, forcing nearly all the black residents to flee. The ever-growing list of sundown towns became so long that black travel writer named Victor Green penned the Negro Motorist Green Book in response. The book served as a written survival guide for aspiring black travelers looking to enjoy the open road, and included a list of restaurants, hotels, stores, and other businesses that would welcome them. But while sundown towns were once thought to have been a shameful relic of the past, some black travelers maintain that they still exist today in some form. One black hiker named Marco Williams described an unsettling experience at a rest stop that he visited in Kentucky in June of 2020. Williams said, "The cashier was like, 'You best not be around here after dark. This is a sundown town.'" The young hiker continued, "I don't think she was being racist towards me. If anything, I got the energy that she was looking out for me, so I believed her, and I got out of there." Indeed, a handful of black residents who live in former sundown towns often describe the sense of uneasiness while they're out and about, being stared at, watched. "It's really strange and weird out here sometimes," said Nicholas Lewis, a black resident of Vienna, Illinois. "Every time I walk around, eyes are on me." In 2005, a sociologist published a book, Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism, in an attempt to show that this ugly part of history often goes unmentioned in American textbooks. To further show the phenomenon, Lowen, the sociologist, joined forces with students at a college to put together an interactive map of known sundown towns in the United States. These pages also included features of sundown towns by state, and it's by no means a complete list, but this map of sundown towns is perhaps the most accurate picture of their overwhelming presence. By definition, and this is a definition by the sociologist that we talked about earlier, any town that has fewer than 10 black people per 10,000 population is a sundown town. Well, it's considered anyway. In the past, some had signs, but because of federal laws against discrimination, the newer contemporary sundown towns are more likely to be like on the undercover. They'll do things like make policies and pricing in their stores, or they'll just do things to make it less appealing for minorities to be in the town. In Martinsville, Indiana, a 21-year-old black woman, Carol Jenkins, was stabbed to death after dark while selling encyclopedias. While sundown towns aren't something that are usually talked about openly nowadays, where they should be, but they aren't, the show Lovecraft Country kind of brought it to light that these towns were a thing. They're still a thing. And the town itself from Lovecraft Country may be a fictional place and have fictional monsters, but the sundown horror is and was very real. And so too were the monsters that prowled those nights.